The laughter echoed down the concrete hallway. Warden Miller leaned against the bars, smirking, holding up a wrinkled orange prison uniform. "If you can fit in this," he said, loud enough for every inmate to hear, "I'll release you myself." The cell block erupted with laughter. Even the guards at the far end chuckled. The woman standing in front of him, heavy-set, quiet, and handcuffed, said nothing. Her name was Denise Parker, 37. She had been arrested for defending herself in a bar fight. Now she was the new joke in the women's ward. Miller circled her like she was prey. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's see if you can even breathe in it." He tossed the uniform onto the floor. Denise's hands trembled, but not from fear. She picked up the orange fabric, her eyes steady and unreadable. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just whispered, "Give me time." And in the months that followed, while the guards laughed, while the inmates called her Big D, while the prison kitchen steamed with sweat and humiliation, Denise changed. She ran laps every dawn, trained with the resistance bands she'd made from torn bedsheets, and refused every extra portion of bread they offered, just to mock her. When the day finally came that Miller saw her again, it wasn't laughter that filled the hallway, it was silence. Because the same woman he had once humiliated was now standing tall in that same uniform, and he couldn't recognize her. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next would make every guard in that prison regret ever laughing at her. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. What nobody knew about Denise Parker was that she hadn't always been the woman they saw that first day in shackles. 3 years before her arrest, she had been something entirely different. A fitness instructor at a community center in Detroit, running morning classes for women who couldn't afford gym memberships. Her apartment was filled with nutrition books, resistance bands, and photos from 5K races she had completed. But life has a way of breaking people down piece by piece. Her mother's cancer diagnosis came first, then the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Denise took on double shifts at a restaurant to pay for treatments, abandoning her fitness routines and surviving on whatever leftover food the kitchen would let her take home. When her mother passed away 6 months later, Denise found herself drowning in debt and grief. Food became her comfort, her escape from the crushing weight of loss. The woman who had once led fitness classes now avoided mirrors and wore oversized clothes to hide what she had become. The night that changed everything started like any other. Denise was working her second job as a bartender at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar on the east side where the regulars knew her story and left her alone. She was wiping down glasses when Jake Morrison walked in. Morrison was trouble from the moment he stepped through the door. 6 feet tall, drunk, and looking for someone to take his anger out on. He had been harassing women all evening, making crude comments and grabbing at anyone who got too close. When he set his sights on Denise, calling her names that cut deeper than any physical blow could, something inside her snapped. Years of suppressed pain, grief, and humiliation erupted all at once. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. Morrison ended up unconscious on the floor with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs. Denise stood over him, her knuckles bloody, breathing hard for the first time in months that felt like real breathing. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Despite witness testimony that Morrison had started the altercation, despite the bartender's statement that Denise had acted in self-defense, the system saw what it wanted to see. A large woman who had hurt a man. Case closed. Riverside Correctional Facility was exactly what you'd expect from an underfunded state prison. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly, and guards who had long ago stopped seeing inmates as human beings. Warden Miller ruled the place like his personal kingdom, and humiliation was his favorite weapon. That first week, Denise learned the unspoken rules. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Accept that you're less than human until the system decides otherwise. But something about Miller's cruel joke with the uniform triggered a memory she had buried deep. She remembered standing in front of her fitness class, telling a woman named Maria, who had just escaped an abusive relationship. Your body is not your enemy. It's the strongest ally you'll ever have. Treat it with respect, and it will carry you through anything. Those words echoed in her cell that night, as she stared at the orange uniform folded on her thin mattress. The fabric felt rough between her fingers, a size medium that would never fit her current body. But for the first time since her arrest, Denise smiled. The transformation didn't start dramatically. There were no movie montages or inspirational music. It began at 5:30 the next morning when Denise quietly slipped out of her cell during the pre-breakfast hour when guards were changing shifts. The prison yard was empty, cold, and unwelcoming. The track was cracked concrete with weeds growing through the gaps. But Denise began to walk, one lap, then another. By the end of that first week, she was managing 5 laps without stopping. Other inmates noticed but said nothing. In prison, minding your own business was survival, but whispers started anyway. Big D's walking the track. She's up before count every morning. Think she's losing her mind? Guard rotation meant that Miller wasn't always watching, but his subordinates reported back. Officer Jenkins, a 20-something rookie who enjoyed the power his uniform gave him, made it his personal mission to make Denise's life harder. He'd schedule random cell inspections during her morning walks, forcing her to start over. He'd assign her extra kitchen duty on days when she looked particularly tired. He'd confiscate the makeshift resistance bands she crafted from torn bedsheets, claiming they were contraband. But Denise adapted. When they took her bands, she used her own body weight. When they interrupted her walks, she exercised in her cell. When they gave her extra work, she turned it into training. Carrying heavy pots became strength training. Scrubbing floors became cardio. The prison kitchen was where the real change began to show. Denise had always been assigned to food prep, cutting vegetables and portioning meals for 800 inmates. The work was hot, sweaty, and mind-numbing, but it also gave her access to something precious in prison: choice. While other inmates fought over seconds and hoarded commissary snacks, Denise began making different decisions. She studied the nutritional information posted on bulk food containers. She learned which vegetables had the most protein, which starches would sustain energy longest, which portions would fuel her body instead of just filling it. The changes were subtle at first. Her uniforms began to fit differently. Her face started to thin out. Her breathing improved during her morning walks. But in a place where routine was everything, even small changes became noticeable. Inmates began to take notice in week 6. Carmen Rodriguez, a lifer who ran the unofficial commissary trade, approached Denise during yard time. "You're looking different, Big D," she said, not unkindly. "You sick or something?" Denise shook her head, continuing her stretches against the chain-link fence. "Just trying to be healthy." Carmen studied her for a moment. "Healthy don't exist in here, girl. This place kills everything eventually." But Denise wasn't listening anymore. She was focused on something else entirely. In her peripheral vision, she had spotted Warden Miller making his rounds, clipboard in hand, that same cruel smirk on his face that he wore the day he threw the uniform at her feet. He hadn't spoken to her since that first day, but his presence was a constant reminder of the promise she had made to herself. Every morning when she laced up her worn sneakers, every evening when she did push-ups in her cell, every meal when she chose nutrients over comfort. The uniform hanging in her locker had become more than clothing. It had become a symbol of transformation, a finish line she was determined to cross. But what Denise didn't realize yet was that her quiet revolution was about to attract attention from the most dangerous person in the facility. And when that attention came, it would test everything she had built in ways she never imagined. The attention Denise was about to receive came from someone who made Warden Miller look like a choir boy. Sandra Ice Williams had been running the women's ward for 12 years. She was serving 3 consecutive life sentences for crimes that made hardened guards nervous just reading her file. Ice had built her reputation on one simple principle: keep the weak weak and the strong under control. When she heard whispers about Big D's transformation, She saw a threat to the careful ecosystem she had constructed. You think you're special now? Ice cornered Denise in the laundry room during her assigned shift. The industrial washers created enough noise to mask their conversation from the guards stationed outside. Denise continued folding towels, her movements precise and calm. I think I'm getting healthier. Ice laughed, but it wasn't the cruel laughter Denise had grown accustomed to. This was something colder, more calculating. Healthy gets you noticed in here. Notice gets you hurt. You understand what I'm telling you? The threat was clear. But Denise had discovered something in those morning runs and late-night exercises. She had found her strength again. Not just physical, but something deeper. The woman who had once led fitness classes, who had fought for her mother's medical care, who had stood up to Jake Morrison that night in the bar, she was still there underneath everything. I understand perfectly, Denise replied, meeting Ice's stare directly. But I'm not stopping. What happened next changed the dynamic of the entire women's ward. Ice's first move was subtle. Denise's morning wake-up calls became mysteriously delayed. Her work assignments shifted to the most physically demanding tasks during her usual exercise times. Her meal portions were reduced under the guise of kitchen inventory shortages. But Denise adapted faster than Ice anticipated. When her morning walks were disrupted, she exercised during lunch breaks. When her portions were cut, she traded commissary items with other inmates for vegetables they didn't want. When her work assignments became more demanding, she turned every task into training. The other inmates watched this silent war with growing fascination. Prison hierarchies were usually fixed, unchangeable as the concrete walls themselves. But something unprecedented was happening. The woman they had once called Big D was not just surviving Ice's pressure, she was thriving under it. By month 3, even the guards began to notice. Officer Martinez, a veteran who had worked the system for 15 years, pulled Denise aside during a shift change. "Whatever you're doing, Parker, keep it quiet," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Ice has connections beyond these walls. She can make your life very difficult, even after you get out." But Denise was no longer the broken woman who had arrived in shackles. "Officer Martinez?" she said, her voice steady and clear. "I've already lived through the worst thing that could happen to me. I lost my mother. I lost my purpose. I lost myself. Everything after that is just noise." The breaking point came during week 14. Denise was in the yard, completing her usual circuit of exercises, when Ice approached, with 4 of her closest associates. The guards were conveniently positioned at the far end of the yard, their backs turned to the confrontation. "Time to learn your place," Ice said, cracking her knuckles. What Ice didn't expect was that the woman she was facing was no longer the same person who had arrived months earlier. Denise's body had transformed, yes, but more importantly, her mind had sharpened. She had spent countless hours thinking, planning, preparing for exactly this moment. The confrontation lasted exactly 37 seconds. When the guards finally turned around, Ice was on the ground, holding her ribs, and Denise was standing calmly, not even breathing hard. But here's what made that moment legendary in Riverside Correctional. Denise didn't gloat. She didn't threaten. She simply helped Ice to her feet and said, "I hope you're okay. I'm going to finish my workout now." The respect that moment earned her was immediate and absolute. Word spread through the prison faster than wildfire. Big D wasn't Big D anymore. She was something else entirely. Someone who commanded respect, not through fear, but through quiet strength and unwavering determination. Even the guards began treating her differently. Her cell inspections became routine rather than punitive. Her work assignments returned to normal schedules. Officer Jenkins, who had once made it his mission to torment her, now nodded respectfully when she passed. But the most significant change was in how other inmates began approaching her. Women who had been struggling with their own battles, their own demons, started asking questions. "How did you do it? What's your secret? Can you help me?" Denise found herself becoming something she had never expected to be in prison. A leader. Not through intimidation or politics, but through example. She began sharing what she had learned about nutrition with inmates who wanted to get healthier. She taught breathing exercises to women struggling with anxiety. She showed others how to turn their daily routines into opportunities for growth. The transformation wasn't just physical anymore. It was philosophical. Denise had discovered that prison could either break you or forge you, and she had chosen to be forged. By month 5, she had lost 63 pounds. Her uniform hung loose in all the right places. Her face had defined cheekbones again. Her eyes carried a confidence that made even the toughest inmates think twice before crossing her. But most importantly, that orange uniform that Warden Miller had thrown at her feet was now hanging in her locker, waiting, size medium. The finish line she had been working toward every single day. What Denise didn't know was that Miller had been watching her progress through security reports and guard observations. The joke he had made that first day was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. Because when someone transforms themselves from the inside out, when they prove that human will is stronger than any system designed to break it, that person becomes something powerful, something that threatens the very foundation of how places like Riverside Correctional operate. And Denise Parker was about to show everyone exactly what that kind of power looked like. The day Denise decided to confront Warden Miller changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 months after that first humiliation, when she walked into the administrative wing wearing that size medium orange uniform. It fit perfectly. The secretary at the front desk did a double take. This wasn't the same woman who had been processed 6 months earlier. This woman had sharp cheekbones, defined shoulders, and eyes that burned with quiet intensity. She moved with the confidence of someone who had conquered their own limitations. "I need to see Warden Miller," Denise said, her voice steady and clear. The secretary fumbled with her phone. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him Denise Parker is here about a promise he made." Miller's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man drunk on his own authority. Awards covering the walls, a mahogany desk that cost more than most inmates' annual salaries, and windows that overlooked the yard where he could watch his kingdom like a king surveying his subjects. When Denise walked through that door, Miller was reviewing budget reports, completely absorbed in the mundane paperwork of running a human warehouse. He looked up casually, expecting to see another routine administrative matter. The pen fell from his hand. The woman standing in front of his desk was wearing the uniform he had mockingly thrown at her feet 6 months earlier. But this wasn't the same person. This was someone else entirely. Someone who carried herself like she owned the room instead of being owned by it. "You said if I could fit in this uniform, you'd release me," Denise said, her arms crossed, her stance wide and unshakable. "I'm here to collect." Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something that looked suspiciously like fear. "That was a joke," he stammered, standing up behind his desk as if the furniture could protect him from what he was seeing. "Funny thing about jokes," Denise replied, stepping closer. "Sometimes they become promises, and promises, Warden Miller, have a way of demanding payment." What happened next revealed the true character of both people in that room. Miller, faced with the living proof that his cruelty had backfired spectacularly, did what bullies always do when confronted with their own powerlessness. He got angry. "You think you're clever? You think this little transformation means anything?" His voice rose, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. "You're still an inmate. You're still nothing." But Denise had learned something powerful during those months of transformation. She had learned that other people's opinions of her were just noise, meaningless sounds that couldn't touch the truth of who she had become. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I am an inmate, for now, but I'm not the same person you tried to break. That person is gone, and the person standing here now, she's not afraid of you anymore." Miller reached for his phone, probably to call security, but Denise held up a hand. "Before you do that, you might want to know what else I've been doing these past 6 months." See, transformation isn't just physical, Warden. It's mental, educational. And I've been learning some very interesting things about how this prison operates. The color drained from Miller's face. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the commissary contracts that mysteriously go to companies owned by your brother-in-law. I'm talking about the medical supply invoices that don't match the actual supplies delivered. I'm talking about the rehabilitation programs that exist on paper, but never actually happen because the money gets redirected to your little pet projects. Miller's hand froze halfway to the phone. You don't know what you're talking about. Officer Martinez has been very helpful. Turns out he's been documenting irregularities for years, waiting for the right moment to speak up. Funny how a little inspiration can give people courage they didn't know they had. The silence in that office was deafening. Miller sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of his own corruption finally catching up to him. He had built his career on the assumption that inmates were powerless, voiceless, disposable. The idea that one of them could not only transform themselves, but also expose his crimes, was beyond his comprehension. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want what you promised. My release, but not just mine. I want comprehensive reform of the conditions in this facility. I want the harassment to stop. I want the cruel jokes to end. I want the women in this prison to be treated like human beings instead of entertainment for bored guards." Denise pulled a thick folder from inside her uniform top. "This contains documentation of every violation, every abuse, every corner that's been cut in this facility. Officer Martinez isn't the only one who's been keeping records. Turns out when you inspire people to believe they have value, they start acting like it." Miller stared at the folder like it was a snake about to strike. "You can't prove any of this. Maybe not all of it. But I don't need to prove all of it. I just need to prove enough. And trust me, Warden, there's more than enough in here to end your career and put you in a cell just like the ones you've been profiting from." The transformation in that room was complete. The man who had once held all, the power, who had humiliated women for his own amusement, who had built his authority on the systematic dehumanization of others, was now the one begging. "Please," Miller said, his voice cracking. "I have a family. I have a reputation." "So did the women you destroyed," Denise replied, without a trace of sympathy. "So did I, before you decided I was fair game for your entertainment." She leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to process my early release immediately. You're going to implement every reform I've outlined in this folder. You're going to ensure that Officer Martinez gets promoted to Deputy Warden with full authority to oversee these changes. And you're going to do it all with a smile, because the alternative is that this folder finds its way to the State Attorney General's office." Miller's hands shook as he reached for his computer keyboard. "The parole board won't approve early release without proper justification." "Then find proper justification. You're creative when it comes to covering up your crimes. Be creative when it comes to fixing them." As Miller began typing, his fingers stumbling over keys like a man trying to defuse a bomb, Denise felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but something deeper. Justice. The kind that comes not from destroying others, but from building yourself up so high that their ability to harm you becomes irrelevant. "One more thing," she said, as Miller printed out the release forms with trembling hands. "That uniform I'm wearing? I'm keeping it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that when someone tells you you're not capable of something, the only opinion that matters is your own." Miller signed the papers without looking up, his signature a barely legible scrawl. "It'll take 24 hours to process through the system." "That's fine," Denise said, taking the papers and folding them carefully. "I've waited 6 months. I can wait one more day. But Warden, those reforms start immediately. And if I hear that anything happens to Officer Martinez or any of the women who helped document your little empire, this folder goes public regardless of any deal we've made." As Denise walked toward the door, Miller called out one last time, "Why didn't you just serve your time quietly? You could have been out in 8 months anyway. Denise paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorknob. Because 8 months of accepting your version of who I am would have killed the person I was meant to become. And I discovered something in here, Warden. I discovered that I'd rather die fighting than live broken. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving Miller alone with his computer screen and the wreckage of his carefully constructed world of cruelty and corruption. The news of Denise's early release spread through the women's ward like electricity through water. But more than her personal victory, the inmates began to notice immediate changes. Guard rotations were adjusted to remove the worst offenders. Kitchen portions returned to standard sizes. The harassment that had been as routine as morning count suddenly stopped. Officer Martinez, now Deputy Warden Martinez, began implementing programs that actually existed instead of just appearing on budget reports. Educational classes resumed. Mental health counseling became available. The gymnasium that had been closed for maintenance for 3 years mysteriously reopened. But perhaps the most significant change was in the women themselves. Denise's example had shown them something they had forgotten during their time in the system. They had shown them that transformation was possible, that dignity could be maintained even in the most degrading circumstances, that strength could be built even when everything seemed designed to break you down. Carmen Rodriguez started her own morning walking group. Sandra Ice Williams, still serving her life sentences, began teaching literacy classes to inmates who couldn't read. Even the youngest inmates, the ones who had arrived broken and hopeless, began to carry themselves differently. The night before her release, Denise sat in her cell one last time, looking at the orange uniform hanging in her locker. Tomorrow she would walk out of Riverside Correctional wearing civilian clothes, donated by a local charity. But tonight, she wanted to remember everything about this journey. She thought about the woman who had arrived 6 months earlier, shackled and humiliated, accepting cruelty as if it were deserved. She thought about the first morning when she had decided to walk laps around a cracked concrete track. She thought about the moment when she realized that her body wasn't her enemy, but her greatest ally. Most of all, she thought about the choice she had made to transform pain into power, humiliation into determination, and despair into unshakable strength. Tomorrow, Denise Parker would walk out of prison a free woman. But tonight, she was already free in every way that mattered. She had reclaimed her dignity, her strength, and her sense of purpose. She had proven that no institution, no matter how designed to break the human spirit, could destroy someone who refused to accept their limitations. The laughter that had echoed down those concrete hallways 6 months earlier had been replaced by something much more powerful: respect, hope, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding the fight, but from using it to discover exactly who you were meant to become. As Denise drifted off to sleep on her narrow prison mattress for the last time, she smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that transformation was not a destination, but a way of life, and she was ready for all of it. The morning of Denise's release arrived with the same gray dawn that had greeted her for 203 days. But this time, she wasn't walking to the yard for exercise. She was walking to freedom. The processing room was sterile and cold, fluorescent lights humming overhead as she signed paper after paper. Her belongings, the few items she had arrived with, were returned in a clear plastic bag. A worn wallet with $17, a broken watch that had stopped working months ago, a photo of her mother that had somehow survived everything. Deputy Warden Martinez handed her the final release documents, his eyes holding something that looked like pride. "You did something remarkable in here, Parker. Don't let the world outside make you forget that." Denise nodded, her throat tight with emotion she hadn't expected. "Thank you for believing change was possible." As she walked toward the main gate, other inmates pressed against the windows of their cells, watching her leave. Some called out encouragement. Others simply stared in silence, perhaps wondering if transformation was possible for them too. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind her for the last time. Outside, the world felt impossibly bright and loud after months of controlled environments and muted colors. Cars rushed past on the highway. Birds sang in trees she had only glimpsed through barred windows. The air smelled different, free. But freedom, Denise quickly discovered, came with its own challenges. The halfway house where she was required to stay was overcrowded and underfunded. Her assigned counselor was a burned-out social worker who had seen too many people cycle through the system to believe in lasting change. Just keep your head down, follow the rules, and don't cause trouble, the counselor advised during their first meeting. Most people who come out of long-term incarceration struggle with adjustment. Don't expect too much from yourself. But Denise had learned something powerful during her transformation. Other people's expectations had no power over her unless she gave them that power. She smiled politely and nodded, but inside she was already making different plans. Finding work proved nearly impossible. The background check question appeared on every application, like a roadblock designed to keep people trapped in cycles of failure. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Check yes, and the application went into the trash. Check no, and risk losing the job when the truth inevitably surfaced. After 3 weeks of rejections, Denise found herself standing outside Murphy's Tavern, the same bar where her life had changed forever. The help wanted sign in the window seemed to mock her. This was where it all started. This was where Jake Morrison's cruelty had triggered the chain of events that led to prison. But as she stared at that sign, Denise realized something profound. She wasn't the same woman who had worked here before. That woman had been broken by grief, drowning in pain, surviving on scraps of self-worth. The woman standing here now had been forged in fire and emerged stronger. She pushed through the door. The owner, Mickey O'Malley, was a gruff man in his 60s who had run the bar for 27 years. He looked up from inventory sheets when she approached, his eyes immediately wary. "I saw your ad for kitchen help," Denise said, her voice steady and confident. "I'd like to apply." Mickey studied her face, perhaps recognizing something familiar. "You look like someone I've seen before. I worked here 3 years ago, before my legal troubles." His expression hardened. "You're the one who put Morrison in the hospital. Cost me a fortune in damages and bad publicity." Denise looked Mickey straight in the eye, her shoulders squared, her voice unwavering. "Yes, I am. And I'd do it again to protect myself. But I'm also the woman who transformed herself in 6 months behind bars, exposed corruption in the prison system, and helped dozens of women find their own strength. The question isn't who I was 3 years ago. The question is whether you're willing to see who I am now." Mickey stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Kitchen opens at 5. Don't be late." 6 months later, Denise stood in front of a mirror in her small apartment, adjusting the collar of a business suit. On the dresser beside her sat that orange prison uniform, carefully folded, a reminder of how far she had traveled. Today, she was opening her own fitness center, funded by donations from people who had heard her story and believed in second chances. The center would specialize in helping women rebuild their lives after trauma, addiction, and incarceration. The same transformation that had saved her in prison would now become her gift to others who needed to discover their own strength. As she locked her apartment door, Denise smiled, remembering Warden Miller's cruel laughter that first day. He had meant to break her, to make her the punchline of his sick joke. Instead, he had given her the greatest gift possible, the motivation to prove that no one could define her worth except herself. The woman who walked out into the morning sun was living proof that transformation isn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. It's about discovering the power that was always inside you, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes, that moment comes when someone tells you that you're not capable of something, and you decide to prove them spectacularly wrong. If this story inspired you, if you've ever been told you weren't capable of change, hit that subscribe button and share this video. Because the greatest revolution isn't proving you can fit into spaces that rejected you. It's creating your own space where everyone fits. Drop a comment if you believe that your past doesn't define your future. And remember, when someone tries to break you, they might just be giving you the chance to rebuild yourself stronger than ever before.